Confessions of an Economic Hitman, The Anatomy of an Empire Built on Debt. John Perkins' Confessions of an Economic Hitman is a confessional, a political treatise, and a chilling insider's account of a world most people never see. Published in 2004 and updated in subsequent editions, the book serves as both a memoir and a mirror, one reflecting the dark side of globalization, American foreign policy, and corporate greed. What Perkins reveals is a modern form of imperialism, one masked by diplomacy and economic aid, but no less coercive or destructive than the empires of old. At the core of the book is the idea of a new breed of conquest, not through swords or soldiers, but through spreadsheets and statistics. Perkins was an economic hitman, EHM, a role that sounds fictional, but as he explains, is both real and far-reaching. His task was to persuade developing nations to accept massive loans from global financial institutions like the World Bank or USAID, ostensibly to fund infrastructure development. The catch? These loans came with strings attached. U.S. companies were hired to build the projects, and the countries were left drowning in debt they could never repay. The real winners weren't the poor in these nations, but the multinational corporations and the American political machine behind them. The making of an EHM. Perkins didn't start his career with dreams of economic subversion. Raised in New Hampshire in a traditional household, he stumbled into the role after a stint in the Peace Corps, where he developed a passion for indigenous cultures and a growing awareness of global injustice. Through a mysterious woman named Claudine, his recruiter, mentor, and seductress, he was groomed for the EHM role. Claudine introduced him to a world of covert economic manipulation, where forecasts were tools of empire and loyalty was bought with perks and power. He worked for Chas T. Main, a consulting firm contracted to prepare economic forecasts for developing nations. These forecasts would be used to justify massive infrastructure investments. However, Perkins admits that his projections were based less on data and more on desired outcomes. He was expected to exaggerate growth potential to secure massive loans, knowing full well that the projects would enrich U.S. companies and leave host nations in perpetual debt. And if leaders resisted, more dangerous operatives, the jackals, would follow. Case studies of covert control. Throughout the book, Perkins shares detailed accounts of his work across multiple countries, painting a consistent pattern of economic exploitation. Indonesia. One of his first major assignments took him to Indonesia, a vast archipelago with abundant resources but fragile political stability. Following the fall of President Sukarno, the U.S. saw an opportunity to win the country over from communism. Perkins' role was to help engineer massive economic forecasts that justified infrastructure loans. The projects, power plants, transportation systems, and ports were contracted to American firms. The Indonesian government took on massive debt, and in return, the U.S. gained influence over its economy and politics. Ecuador, perhaps one of the most emotionally compelling chapters, involves Ecuador and its president Jaime Roldos, a leader who defied the EHM system. Roldos prioritized national sovereignty and pushed for oil profits to benefit the Ecuadorian people rather than foreign corporations. Perkins admired him and even saw him as a kindred spirit. When Roldos died in a plane crash under suspicious circumstances, Perkins was devastated. He is convinced Roldos was assassinated, just like Panama's Omar Torrijos, for standing in the way of U.S. economic interests. Panama, the story of Omar Torrijos mirrors that of Roldos. Torrijos resisted U.S. efforts to control the Panama Canal and refused to sign exploitative contracts. He, too, perished in a mysterious plane crash. These events underscore the book's haunting assertion. When economic hitmen fail, the jackals, CIA-backed operatives, step in. And when they fail, the military follows, as seen in Iraq and other conflicts. Saudi Arabia. Not every operation required a jackal. In Saudi Arabia, the U.S. secured a different kind of arrangement. Rather than incur debt, the Saudis agreed to recycle petrodollars by investing oil profits in U.S. securities. In return, American companies built massive infrastructure projects. It was a mutually beneficial deal for the elites on both sides, but it solidified a system of dependency and ensured Saudi alignment with U.S. geopolitical goals. Iran and the Shah. Another compelling case is Iran. Although much of the groundwork was laid before Perkins' time, he recounts the CIA-backed overthrow of democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and the installation of the Shah, a brutal dictator loyal to U.S. oil interests. It was a clear demonstration of how economic influence and political manipulation were used to enforce American dominance. Economic tools of empire. Perkins explains how the modern empire doesn't rely on occupying armies, but on debt. The cycle begins with extravagant infrastructure loans. The money never really leaves the United States. It goes straight to U.S. companies contracted to build dams, highways, and power plants. Meanwhile, the developing country is saddled with interest payments that eventually spiral out of control. When the country defaults, the U.S. gains leverage: military bases, UN votes, or favorable oil and trade agreements. Perkins refers to this as debt trap diplomacy, long before the term gained widespread recognition. While the term is now often applied to China's Belt and Road Initiative, Perkins makes clear that the United States pioneered the strategy decades earlier. This economic imperialism creates what he calls a corporatocracy, an unholy alliance of government, banking, and corporate interests that functions beyond accountability. Decisions are made not by elected officials, but by faceless executives and consultants. And the beneficiaries are not the citizens of developing countries, but shareholders in multinational firms. The human cost. Perkins doesn't just focus on economics, he emphasizes the devastating human toll. In country after country, the poorest suffer the most. Indigenous lands are destroyed for oil drilling. Traditional communities are displaced to make way for dams. Public services like healthcare and education are slashed to meet debt obligations. The statistics Perkins provides are sobering. For every $100 of oil extracted from Ecuador, less than $3 stays in the country. The rest goes to corporate profits and debt payments. He also notes that development projects rarely benefit the majority. Airports and industrial parks serve elites and foreign workers, not local farmers or indigenous communities. The gap between rich and poor widens. In many places, resentment festers and sometimes erupts into violence. Perkins draws a direct line between economic oppression and terrorism. Desperate people, he argues, do desperate things. The empire strikes back. The book also touches on Perkins' involvement with companies like Enron and the role of corporate malfeasance in expanding economic control. He argues that when corporations grow more powerful than governments, democracy is at risk. Policies are shaped not by public good, but by profit margins. And when leaders resist, be they in Latin America or the Middle East, they are labeled enemies, destabilized, or removed. This pattern reached a boiling point in Iraq. Perkins suggests that Saddam Hussein was once an ally, supported when it suited U.S. interests. But when he became unmanageable, the narrative changed. Perkins describes the invasion of Iraq as a last resort after EHMs and jackalls failed. It's a damning assessment of American foreign policy, suggesting that war is often the continuation of economic coercion by other means. Confession and redemption. While the book is a searing critique of American empire, it is also deeply personal. Perkins portrays himself as a man who was seduced by money, power, and a sense of purpose. He didn't set out to become an agent of exploitation, but he didn't resist either. His transformation, from eager recruit to disillusioned whistleblower, is the emotional arc of the book. He describes the guilt he felt witnessing the consequences of his work. He talks about sleepless nights, failed relationships, and the psychological burden of knowing he had betrayed his values. His daughter's encouragement becomes a turning point. When he tells her he's afraid of the consequences of speaking out, she replies, "If they get you, I'll carry on." It is a powerful moment of reckoning. Perkins eventually left his job and began working with indigenous rights groups, using his knowledge to expose the system he once served. He admits that writing the book was a risk, both personally and professionally, but insists that silence was no longer an option. His confession is not just an airing of guilt, but a call to action. A wake-up call for the West. Perkins' message is as relevant today as it was 2 decades ago. As inequality grows and climate crises accelerate, the mechanisms he describes remain largely intact. The faces may change, but the system endures. Development loans continue. Corporate influence expands. Wars are still fought for resources. The book challenges readers to re-examine what progress means. Is GDP growth worth the destruction of communities? Are we comfortable living in a world where a small elite prospers while billions live on less than $2 a day? Perkins doesn't offer easy answers, but he urges us to ask harder questions. He also calls for a new kind of leadership, one based not on domination, but on cooperation. He envisions a world where development serves people, not profit, where business can be ethical, where empathy matters more than markets. It's an ambitious vision, but one grounded in the belief that change is possible. Final reflections. Confessions of an Economic Hitman is a rare book, part thriller, part memoir, part political manifesto. It reveals the inner workings of a system most people never see and connects the dots between economics, geopolitics, and morality. It is not a comfortable read, but it is an essential one. For anyone seeking to understand how the world really works, how nations are controlled, and how power operates under the guise of aid and development, this book is a must-read. It forces readers to confront uncomfortable truths, that the comforts of the developed world often come at the expense of the developing one, that aid is not always altruistic, that democracy, in many places, is a facade. And yet, the book also offers hope. By acknowledging his role and speaking out, Perkins models what accountability looks like. He reminds us that awareness is the first step to change, and that even the most entrenched systems can be challenged. He urges readers not to accept injustice as inevitable, but to see themselves as agents of change. In the end, Confessions of an Economic Hitman is more than a book, it's a catalyst. It leaves you questioning not only the world, but your place in it. And that, perhaps, is its greatest achievement.